Hello, and welcome back to Crafted in China. I'm Freddy. This is the podcast where I tell the stories of Chinese tech companies and beyond, the history, the founders, the deals, from a perspective you don't usually hear in the West. And if you're new here, you can listen to this one on its own, but it's really the second half of a story. Quick recap. Wang Chuanfu built a battery company in Shenzhen that became the third biggest battery maker in the world. Then in January 2003, he bought a failing car company, the stock crashed almost 30%, and he answered all of it with one sentence. I am going to spend the rest of my life on making cars. One question, could his previous method survive cars? And here's the honest answer up front. It nearly didn't, twice. What I find fascinating about the next 20 years is that this is not a clean rocket ship story. It's a company that gets it badly wrong, almost gives up, sits in the wilderness for a decade, and then comes back and beats Tesla on volume. And right at the end, just as it looks unstoppable, the first real cracks appear. So that's the ride. A car nobody wanted, Warren Buffett, a near-death decade, and then the comeback, and the cost of it. Let's start in Xi'an. So, Qinchuan Automobile, up in Xi'an, small plant, old equipment, real debts, and a small sedan called Flyer that wasn't selling well. But it had the one thing BYD needed, a manufacturing license. Wang didn't buy a car company, he bought a permission slip. And the very first thing he does is so on brand it's almost funny. He goes to the bookshop. Wang Chuanfu. This is a man who now runs a car company, goes and buys the university textbooks, automotive engineering, the basics, the textbooks a first-year student would use, and he reads them. Because remember who he is, he's an excellent engineer. His instinct is never hire someone who knows. His instinct is understand it myself, down to the part. But he also needs people who've actually built cars. And there's this detail about how he recruits his chief engineer, a man named Lian Yuanbo, who came from inside Qinchuan. The way Lian later tells it, other private bosses who tried to poach him led with the package, the salary, the title, the car. Wang never did that. Wang just talked about cars. Over and over, late into the night, 3 nights of it apparently, and not once did he open with what he'd pay. And that worked, because the people Wang wants are the people who'd rather build the thing than be paid for the thing. Now how do you actually design your first car when you've never made one? BYD's answer was, let's say, very direct. They bought a couple of Toyota Corollas. And the Corolla is the most boringly reliable mass-market sedan on Earth. It sells in the millions. It basically never breaks. So BYD took them apart. They studied how every piece was made, broke the car down into parts and subsystems, handed those out across teams and rebuilt their own version. Where a part was protected by a patent, they'd change it just enough to step around it. And look, I'm not going to dress this up. This is reverse engineering. In plain English, the early BYD cars borrowed very heavily from Toyota. The resemblance was close enough that there was actually a small informal trade, where owners would swap the BYD badge for a Toyota badge for a few hundred yuan, just so the car looked like the real thing in the car park. In fairness, this is also exactly how Japan and Korea climbed the same ladder a few decades earlier. You learn by copying the leader, then you slowly earn the right to lead. But I think you have to say it plainly. At this stage, BYD is not an innovator, it's a fast, cheap, very disciplined learner. The innovation comes later, and when it comes, it's real, just not yet. And the first attempt was a disaster. BYD developed a model, internally it was called 316, and before launching it they showed it to their dealers. The verdict was brutal. The dealers basically said, the looks, the interior, the way it drove, all of it, no. And this is a car they'd already poured a huge amount of money into, hundreds of millions of yuan by some accounts. And Wang killed it, just killed it, walked away from all that sunk cost rather than ship a car the market had already rejected. And I think that's the first sign the method might actually transfer, because the battery business taught him a hard rule. Cost is survival, but shipping a bad product is also death. So he ate the loss and started again. And the do-over was the car that made BYD, the F3. They built it fast, roughly a year, where the industry norm was 3, partly by putting design and manufacturing people physically together so problems got caught the same day, the same way they'd compressed everything in batteries. And then they did something clever on the launch. They didn't go national. They picked one city, Jinan, in Shandong province, and launched there first in September 2005. And on the first day, they took around 2,000 orders, then rolled it out city by city, building momentum and word of mouth instead of spraying it everywhere at once. And the F3, well, it looked a lot like a Corolla, and it cost about half as much, somewhere around 70,000 yuan. For a huge number of Chinese families in the mid-2000s, that was the whole pitch right there. A car that looks like the reliable foreign one, at a price you can actually reach. And it worked. The 100,000th F3 rolled off the line a bit over a year after the national launch. By 2009, BYD was selling around 240,000 of them in a single year. The F3 became the best-selling sedan in China, the first homegrown car in its class to push past 30,000 units in a month. And the timing, again, the timing. In 2009, the government cut the purchase tax on cars with smaller engines, under 1.6 liters, to get the market moving through the financial crisis. Guess what the F3 had? A small, cheap, tax-friendly engine. BYD's total sales that year jumped to around 450,000 cars, well over double the year before. So if you're keeping score on the question, can the method survive cars? At this point, the answer looks like a clear yes. Find the opening, cut the cost, learn from the best, move before the market catches up. The battery playbook, run again, on wheels. It's working. And it's working well enough that it attracts the most famous investor on the planet. So, 2008, the middle of the global financial crisis, when most of the world is selling everything that isn't nailed down. There's an investor called Li Lu who'd spotted BYD. Li Lu is Chinese-born, came to the US as a student, ended up running a hedge fund, and by this point had become one of Charlie Munger's closest investing partners. And Li Lu brings BYD to Munger, who was Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway. Munger got very excited. He later said there were only 2 times in his life he pounded the table and told Buffett, "You have to buy this." One was Costco, the other was BYD. And the way Munger talked about Wang Chuanfu is one of those quotes that sounds ridiculous until you sit with it. He said more or less, if you don't back this guy, you're not just missing one great founder. You're missing a Thomas Edison and a Henry Ford and a Bill Gates and a Jack Welch, all rolled into one person. I mean, that is an absurd thing to say about anyone, but Munger meant it as a description of range. Part inventor, part manufacturer, part empire builder, part operator. And in September 2008, Berkshire put in around 1.8 billion Hong Kong dollars, roughly 230 million US dollars, for about 10% of BYD. And there's a detail here I really like. Buffett's side reportedly wanted more, something closer to a fifth of the company. And Wang said no. He'd take the validation, he'd take the cash, but he was not going to hand over that much of the company he'd built from 20 people in a rented factory. And that bet, by some measures, eventually ran up something like 30 times over the years that followed. But forget the multiple for a second. The thing that mattered in 2008 wasn't the money, it was the stamp. A Chinese car maker that 5 years earlier investors had called insane was now part owned by Warren Buffett. That's a different kind of currency. And it went to Wang's head a little, and I think that's fair to say. Around 2007, before the Buffett deal even closed, Wang had stood up and announced that BYD would be the #1 car maker in China by 2015, and the #1 car maker in the entire world by 2025. And people laughed. Of course they laughed. This is a company that's been making cars for about 4 years, whose flagship product is a cut-price Corolla. Hold on to that promise, though. #1 in China by 2015. #1 in the world by 2025. We're going to come back to it. Because the way that promise ages is the whole point of the second half of this story. So now we get to the hard part. The part episode 1 promised I wouldn't skip. The accusations, the controversies, the uncomfortable years. Because right after the high point, BYD nearly destroys itself. And it does it in the most ordinary way a fast-growing company can. It believes its own hype. Riding the F3 boom, BYD decides the bottleneck is distribution, so it floods the market with dealers. By 2010, it had something like 1,100 dealerships, split into multiple separate sales networks, all selling BYD cars. The logic was simple: more outlets, more sales. But the cars weren't selling fast enough to fill all those new shelves. Inventory piled up. Dealers were sitting on 3 months of stock or more, when 1 month is healthy. And to hit its own targets, BYD kept pushing cars onto dealers who couldn't sell them, and the dealers revolted. In 2010 and 2011, you got a wave of them quitting the network and a wave of unhappy press coverage. Accusations that BYD's dealer contracts were heavy-handed, that the terms were a trap, that the company was stuffing its channel to flatter its own numbers. And in fairness, some of that is just what happens when any car company overexpands into a slowdown. But some of it was real. BYD had put pressure on the people below it to carry a problem that was really upstream in its own targets. And that pattern, putting heavy pressure on the people you depend on, is going to come back at the very end of this episode. And the numbers went where you'd expect. BYD's annual net profit had been somewhere around 2.5 billion yuan. Within about 2 years, it collapsed to something like 80 million. That is not a dip, that is the floor falling out. There were layoffs. The stock fell hard. The Buffett magic looked for a while like a mistake. And here's the thing I respect about this stretch. In 2011, Wang stood up and basically admitted he got it badly wrong. He called it an adjustment year, and he laid out what he later described as 3 relationships he'd handled badly. The relationship with the dealers, the relationship with customers, meaning product quality, and the relationship with the media. And he said something I think is genuinely useful for anyone running a company. He said, in 2009, 99% of my meetings were about capacity, about making more. And that, he said, was my mistake. He'd been so focused on volume that he'd stopped paying attention to whether the cars were good and whether the people selling them were okay. That's a very honest thing for a founder to say out loud. And during this low point, in 2010, Buffett actually came to visit, spent a few days at BYD, and whatever you think of the bet, that's the difference between patient money and panic money. He didn't bail at the first bad quarter, he showed up. But the company doesn't snap back. And this is the part people forget. BYD then spends years, call it 2012 to 2019, kind of stuck. There were long stretches where it felt like the sales just sat there, month after month, going nowhere. Inside the company, there was apparently real talk about whether they should just stop making cars altogether. From the outside, BYD looked like a company that had had its moment with the F3, taken Buffett's money, made a big promise, and then quietly run out of steam. And it gets worse, because the battery side, the thing BYD was actually born to do, also looks like it's losing. So, quick bit of context. There are 2 big families of electric car battery. One is based on lithium iron phosphate, people say LFP. It's cheaper and safer, but historically it stored less energy, so less range. The other is the nickel-based stuff, the ternary batteries, which packed in more range, which is what buyers said they wanted. And Wang, stubbornly, kept betting on the cheaper, safer LFP. For a few years, that looked like a terrible call. As the government tied its subsidies to range, the market stampeded toward the nickel batteries. LFP's share fell off a cliff, from something like 3/4 of the market, down to under 15%. And a company you may have heard of, Contemporary Amperex Technology Company Limited, shortened to CATL, the one that bet the other way, shot past BYD to become the biggest battery maker in the world. BYD, the battery company, was no longer the #1 battery company, and the press started using a word that must have hurt: arrogant. BYD is arrogant, they said, too proud to follow the market. And by 2019, the squeeze is brutal, profit down something like 40%. The company is spending enormous amounts on research, on the order of 8 billion yuan a year, and from the outside it looks like money lit on fire. Some shareholders wanted the management cleared out. If you'd looked at BYD at the end of 2019, you'd have seen a car company stuck in neutral and a battery company that had been overtaken, pouring cash into R&D with nothing obvious to show for it. This is the second time the method nearly dies. And Wang's answer to all of it is a single image that I can't stop thinking about. He talked about BYD having a technology fish pond. The idea being, these years that look stagnant from the outside were actually stocking the pond, breeding the technologies quietly, and when the moment comes, we just reach in and pull out a fish. Now when he said that, it sounded like the kind of thing a cornered CEO says to buy time. The hard question of this whole episode is right here. Is that conviction? Or is it stubbornness with a nice metaphor? Because from the outside in 2019, those 2 things look identical. The only thing that tells them apart is what happens next. And what happens next is the fish pond opens. And the first fish is one nobody saw coming. Masks. Early 2020, COVID hits. China is desperately short of protective equipment, and BYD, a car and battery company, says, "We'll make masks." And because it makes so much of its own machinery in-house, it doesn't wait around to order mask-making equipment. It builds the machines itself, fast. Within weeks, BYD is reportedly producing on the order of 1 million masks a day, becoming, briefly, one of the biggest mask makers on the planet. And the reason it could move that fast wasn't luck. It was a decade of vertical integration decisions made long before anyone had heard of COVID. When you've spent years building the capability to make your own machines, your own tooling, your own everything, you can turn the entire company on a dime. That's what all that vertical integration was for. And I should say what vertical integration actually means at BYD, because it goes further than most people realize. We're talking about batteries, motors, power electronics, body parts, seats, even the molds that stamp the metal. And chips. BYD acquired a semiconductor facility and started producing its own IGBT chips, the power chips that control how electricity flows through an electric drivetrain. When the global chip shortage hit in 2021 and 2022, and car makers everywhere were shutting production lines for lack of a $30 chip, BYD kept building, because it made its own. That's the payoff of the strategy. It's slow, it's expensive, and it looks like overkill, right up until the moment it isn't. But the fish that actually changed the world were two pieces of technology, both landing right around 2020 and 2021. The first was the blade battery. So, remember BYD's stubborn bet on the cheaper, safer LFP chemistry, the one that stored less energy? What BYD's engineers did was attack the packaging instead of the chemistry. Instead of fat little cells bundled into modules, they made long, thin, flat cells like blades and laid them edge to edge across the floor of the car. That clever geometry got back a lot of the range that LFP had been giving away, while keeping the safety and the lower cost. And the launch was a piece of theater. BYD put out a video of a nail penetration test, which is the brutal one. You drive a steel nail straight through a charged battery and see what happens. The nickel battery in the demo basically catches fire. The blade battery barely reacts. Now, in fairness, CATL pushed back hard and argued the comparison wasn't fair, and you should treat a marketing demo as a marketing demo. But the underlying point, that this chemistry is genuinely safer, that part was real. And the years of looking arrogant suddenly looked like patience. And the second fish is the one that to me is the real masterstroke, the DMI hybrid. BYD had actually been working on hybrid technology for over a decade by this point. Back in 2008, it launched something called the F3DM, which at the time was the world's first mass-produced plug-in hybrid car. So the technology was not new, but those early DM systems were built around performance. Power, speed, acceleration. In 2021, BYD split the line in two. DMP kept that performance focus. DMI, the I standing for intelligent, went the other direction entirely. So here's the problem DMI solved. Earlier hybrids tended to treat the petrol engine as the main thing and the battery as a helper, which meant once the battery ran down, you were lugging a heavy battery around on a thirsty engine. BYD flipped it. DMI runs the car primarily on electric and uses a small, efficient petrol engine mostly as a generator to keep the battery topped up. The official fuel economy figures they quoted were startling, down around 2.5 liters per 100 kilometers on the test cycle. But the key part was the price. They priced these hybrids to go head-to-head with ordinary petrol cars. No big green premium. And that's the decisive move. Because now a family looking at a Toyota Corolla or a Camry can buy the equivalent BYD hybrid for less money, and it uses less fuel as well. Cheaper to buy, cheaper to run, and it drives like an EV around the city. In China, we had a phrase for what this did to the petrol incumbents, snatching food from the tiger's mouth. And in April 2022, BYD did something no other major car maker on Earth had done. It stopped building pure combustion engine cars entirely. Just stopped, all in on electric and plug-in hybrid, which, when you think about it, is that battery logic one more time. Don't chase the incumbent down the road they own. Change the road. And then the numbers go vertical. Around 740,000 cars in 2021, up over 70%. Then about 1.86 million in 2022, up over 150%. And in 2022, BYD became the best-selling car brand in China. Not the best-selling local brand, the best-selling brand, full stop. The first time a homegrown Chinese carmaker had beaten the big foreign joint ventures at the top of the table. The fish pond was real. So let's go back to that promise, the one everybody laughed at. Number one in China by 2015, number one in the world by 2025. The 2015 target, number one in China, he missed it. In 2015, BYD was a leader in new energy cars, but it was nowhere near the biggest car maker in China overall. He got there eventually, in 2022, 7 years late. And the 2025 target, number one in the world? Let's be precise, because this is where it gets interesting. In 2025, BYD sold somewhere in the region of 4.25 million vehicles. That makes it roughly the sixth biggest car maker on Earth. Toyota is still comfortably number one. So, by the plain reading of his own boast, he missed it. But look closer. Of those cars, the pure electric ones came to something like 2.25 million, and that figure, for the first time, was more than Tesla sold. So BYD became the world's biggest seller of pure electric cars, and the world's biggest seller of new energy vehicles overall. In the only game Wang actually said mattered, the new energy game, the one he bet the company on back in 2003, he is number one in the world. He just isn't number one at the old game, the petrol game, which he deliberately walked away from. So did the braggart deliver? Late, and with an asterisk, but in the way that counts, yes, he mostly did. And BYD didn't stop at China's border. In 2025, it exported on the order of 1 million cars, more than double the year before, and BYD alone accounted for something like half of the growth in China's entire car export machine. Cars heading to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, to the Middle East. And if you want a sense of where the technology has actually gotten to, look at the Yangwang U8. Yangwang is BYD's ultra-premium brand, the one that costs the equivalent of $150,000 or more. And the U8 can do things that look like a party trick until you understand the engineering behind them. It can spin in place, a full 360, in its own footprint, by running each of its 4 electric motors independently in different directions. They call it tank turn, and if you drive it into water, it floats, and it can propel itself through the water using the wheel motors. Now you might reasonably ask, who needs a car that swims? But that's not the point. The point is that BYD now has a line of vehicles where it's demonstrating control of the whole system, every motor, every kilowatt, every line of software, in a way that no traditional car maker built on outsourced components can easily replicate. That's the vertical integration story, made visible. By 2023, BYD was inside the global top 10 car makers. By 2025, top 6 overall, and number 1 in electric and plug-in hybrid cars, the bet Wang had been making since 2003. So that's the comeback. And if I stop there, it'd be a tidy, triumphant story. But this is being recorded in 2026, and the honest version doesn't get to end on the victory lap. Because right now the first real cracks are showing. Through the second half of 2025, BYD's sales at home started to slide. A few things hit at once. The Chinese government got uncomfortable with how vicious the price war between car makers had become, this endless race to the bottom, and started leaning on the industry to cool it. In China, there's a word for it, involution, nejuan, the idea that everyone keeps competing harder and cutting prices, but nobody actually gets ahead. And the official message became, in effect, stop the bleeding. So BYD, which had been the most aggressive discounter, had to ease off the very weapon that had powered its rise. On top of that, a tax break that had helped electric cars was being scaled back for 2026. And then, the headline. In early 2026, on a monthly basis, BYD got overtaken by Geely, another Chinese car maker. BYD had worn the monthly sales crown in China for something like 40 months straight, and that run ended. Now 1 or 2 months is not a verdict, and in fact, by April 2026, BYD was back on top. But the point still stands. The machine that looked unstoppable had, for a moment, been passed, and that moment matters. And then there are the uncomfortable questions, the ones that come with being this big. BYD now employs something approaching 1 million people. It's said to have on the order of 120,000 engineers, and the same intensity that built the place shows up, from the inside, as a very hard place to work. The accounts you hear describe long hours and heavy pressure, the kind of grind where the advice is, come, learn fast, and get out before it burns you. And remember that pattern from the dealer crisis, leaning hard on the people you depend on. It's back, in a new form. There have been complaints that BYD squeezes its suppliers, paying them slowly, pushing the cost of its famous low prices down onto the smaller companies underneath it. In fairness, every giant manufacturer gets some version of this thrown at it, but you can't tell the cost story without telling this part. The relentless cost discipline that is BYD's superpower is the same trait that, pointed at your workers and your suppliers, becomes the thing people resent. And Wang himself, at the end of 2025, more or less admitted the company had a problem. He said, in effect, that BYD's technology lead had been getting diluted as rivals caught up, and that some genuine customer pain points, like slow charging in the cold, still weren't solved. But then he said the thing he always says, that BYD has heavyweight technology held in reserve that he can't talk about yet, that the fish pond still has fish in it, and that 120,000 engineers are the reason he's not worried. And here's my honest take. The last time he said trust the fish pond, in 2019, he was right, spectacularly right. So you can't just roll your eyes at it, but you also can't assume lightning strikes the same pond twice. That's the open question BYD is sitting inside right now, in real time. We genuinely don't know the answer yet. So let me bring it all together, the way we did last time. The question we started with was, can the method survive cars? Find the opening, cut cost, learn from the best, move before the market catches up, and make as much of it yourself as you possibly can. And the answer, after more than 20 years, is yes. But barely, not in a straight line, and not for free. Because here's what I find genuinely instructive about this story. More than the Buffett cameo or the Tesla headline, it's that decade in the wilderness, the 2012 to 2019 stretch where BYD looked stuck, looked overtaken, looked like it was burning money on research for nothing. That's the part that's easy to skip and impossible to skip, honestly, because the comeback wasn't magic, it was the fish pond. It was years of unglamorous, unrewarded, looks like failure capability building that only made sense in hindsight. Most companies and most people can't sit in that. They cut the R&D, they follow the market, they chase the chemistry everyone else is chasing. Wang didn't. And the line between that being visionary conviction and being dumb luck is honestly thinner than the triumphant version admits. And the deepest irony of the whole story is the one we're watching land right now. The thing that built BYD, that bone-deep obsession with cost that started with a kid in rural Anhui watching his family scrape together 10 yuan for school, that same instinct scaled up to 1 million employees, is now the thing the criticism is aimed at, the supplier squeeze, the grind, the price war the government is trying to stop. The superpower and the liability are the same trait. They always were. And the question for the next chapter isn't really about technology. It's whether a company this enormous and this vertically integrated can stay as fast and as hungry as the rented factory with 20 people that started all of this. And maybe by the time that chapter is written, I'll be back to tell it. So that's BYD making cars. From a permission slip in Xi'an, to a copied Corolla, to Warren Buffett, through a near-death decade, to beating Tesla, to the first month in years it didn't come first. If you've stayed with me through both halves of this, thank you, genuinely. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, and leave a comment. Tell me what you make of BYD, or which company you want me to dig into next. I'll see you in the next episode.